Get my 6. Hello everybody. Welcome to a very beautiful but blustery October afternoon here on the homestead. I want you to get my 6 because I want you to enjoy the beauty. I've been out here. I had my nap this afternoon. I'm out here reviving myself with my after nap, mid-afternoon coffee. Cherish my naps. And I've just been watching the treetops in the wind. It's very windy today. We've got a lot of high winds, and it makes for a beautiful scene. So I've chosen that to be the backdrop for our story today. And keep your eyes open because it appears as if we may or may not have a surprise October visitor among us coming around to hear these stories. Hopefully that's why they're coming around. This morning I actually installed a few more cameras at different locations on the property. So if we get anything of interest on video, I'll certainly upload that to the channel. I want to thank all of you who have been coming around daily to hear these stories. Again, I'm reading stories from October Nights 2, 31 more tales for the Halloween season. The sequel to October Nights Part 1, of course. One of the most common comments we get on the channel by vertically challenged individuals who live under bridges is, what does any of this have to do with homesteading? Or they'll say, I came here for homesteading videos. This guy just sits around and talks and tells stupid stories. What's any of this have to do with homesteading? Let me tell you, storytelling is an art, and I do it, though I claim not to be a great artist. But I have a great appreciation for the art, both in the written word and the oral word, the oral tradition. And if you don't think storytelling has anything to do with homesteading, you, sir or ma'am, do not understand history. And I'm not jading. Remember, that's an acronym which stands for Justify, Argue, Defend, Explain. JADE. I jaded for many years. I come from a background in which jading was a daily necessity of survival in hopes of avoiding abuse. But I've left that background long ago, but unfortunately it did take me a while to get away from jading. I refuse to do it today, so I'm not jading. Do you hear that tree knock? Yeah, you got to keep your eyes open for him, her, it, or they. It's their migratory season. So I am not jading in regard to answering the question, which really is not a question. It's just an insult, guised as a question. But I'm giving a bit of history on storytelling. If you look back to pre-internet days, pre-electricity days, when everybody was homesteading off the grid, there was only so much time of each day spent toiling in the fields, growing vegetables in the garden, going out into the forest to harvest the meats. The rest of the time was spent resting. And the biggest form of entertainment when people were rested up, didn't want to work, the work was done, was storytelling. And people were quite known county-wide at times if they were good storytellers. Now, I don't claim to be one. I'm probably a little bit better than average because I spend a lot of time doing it. And as we are what we repetitively do, I'm better at it than most. If you like good movies, you got to go back in time and thank the storytellers, because the people that wrote the movies, the producers, the directors, the actors and the actresses, they're walking on the shoulders of giants. If you enjoy a good book, and I'm not just talking about mine, but I'm talking about some of the great novels of history. A good book I read recently is Where the Crawdads Sing. It's a now big blockbuster movie. My beautiful bride Dearly, a.k.a. Giggly Girl, and myself watched it just a couple nights ago. I read the book a couple of months ago. It's a lost art. Thank God there are still people that do it. And as somebody that does it, I thank God for those of you who come to hear the stories and hear the tales. Now, with that said, I want to explain a little something about the story. Because not this story, but stories themselves. Somebody commented yesterday on a story I told. It was called Deadbeat, the unfortunate demise of Uncle Gimpy. Somebody and I would give a shout out if I could remember the name, but it escapes me at this time, mentioned, have you told this story before? This sounds familiar. I've gotten that comment before as well. Stories are often evolving, living things. Stories can incite memories, which is the case for today's story. It's called The Call That Never Came. Some of you who have been followers of this channel for some time are going to think that this story sounds familiar because I've talked about these events in the beginning of this story 3 or 4 times throughout the course of the years this channel has been active. And with winter coming, I have reason to believe I'm going to be talking about them again as they're going to start up again this winter. Some really strange phenomena, and it'll be explained in the beginning of the story. But good stories are always evolving. They're always unfolding a little bit more, providing a little bit more pieces to a puzzle, as it were. They never die. They live forever, especially the good ones. So, with no further ado, as my beautiful bride dearly, aka Giggly Girl, would say, I'm going to shut up about the history of storytelling and homesteading and the evolution of ongoing stories. And I'm going to read you this one. I hope you like it. October 4, The Call That Never Came. By the way, autographed copies of this book are available from our Etsy store. The link is in the description box below. You can get these in print or Kindle on Amazon. You can support the channel by way of super chats or through direct donations through our PayPal link, which is on the About section of our page. Or you can support the channel and me and my family the best way possible that doesn't cost you a penny. Just keep coming back and watching the videos. If you can't afford to buy the book, no worries, because in the month of October, every single story from the book is being read to you here. So just keep coming back, okay? There's an odd occurrence that takes place in the living room of my home every winter. I don't know exactly what it is, and I don't know why it only happens during the winter, but that's just how it is. I will first describe exactly what this occurrence is, and it shan't take long, for it's quite simple, and then I will relay a true tale that this strange occurrence has brought back to mind. A tale of events that took place a quarter of a century ago as of this writing. I am an early riser. I wake each day, well, most days, at 5:30 a.m. I enjoy 45 minutes of solitude and over-caffeinated coffee before waking my wife up at 6:15. She's never been a coffee drinker, though I prepare her a hot cup each morning, and she sits lengthwise on the love seat and holds it and smells it a bit, and every now and then takes a sip or two, but never drinks it. And then I wake our son up at 6:30. Together, my wife and I see that our son is fed and dressed and ready for school, and then we put him on the bus at the end of our long country driveway at 7 a.m. And then we sit around and miss him for the rest of the day. We actually work from home and we get things that need to be done, but we do miss him the whole while that he's gone. And I hope you don't mind a quick interjection here, but I have a story to tell. I came to a young lady's defense here 2 weekends ago at a college football game. A young lady that a lot of people at Scott Stadium watching a football game there thought was a dumbass. That's the name that I heard her called. We were sitting in the student section, as we always do, and during a television commercial timeout, they'll often have these little games they play. And this game, there was a challenge. They brought a girl down from random from the student section, pretty thing, and they said, okay, in 15 seconds, name as many cereals as you can name. She was well dressed. I mean, like so many of the girls at UVA, looked like if things don't go well for her in academia, she can always pursue a modeling career. But I'm sure things will go quite well for her in academia, or she wouldn't be admitted to that fine institution. She said, cereals? And he said, yes, go. And he held the microphone to her mouth, and she named, I think, 2 cereals in 15 seconds. And everybody was like looking around, what? Well, and then, of course, the challenge is you have to beat one of the guys on the team. So they asked a football player, and they held the microphone to his mouth, and he just rattled off probably the names of 15 cereals in 15 seconds. So she didn't win. She didn't get the T-shirt or whatever it was. And so we just heard all around us, dumbass, dumbass, dumbass. And there was a woman beside me about my age, and she said to the guy beside her, she said, "How can you only name 2 cereals in 15 seconds?" And I looked over at the woman. She was right there. It was a crowded stadium. And I said, she probably grew up in a family that cooked breakfast in the mornings. And I saw understanding dawn on that woman's face. And there were a couple of people around me who overheard me, and they were like, it never occurred to them. I thought of that when I was reading this part in the book. That's why we get up so early, and that's why we get up together as a family, and that's why we get our son up. I'm proud to say that every morning before our son goes to school, he eats breakfast, and he eats breakfast that is cooked and prepared and is hot and is warm. And I'm proud that if he were to be given that same challenge, people would call him a dumbass because he probably couldn't name 15 cereals no matter how much time he was given. The girl was not a dumbass. And there's a reason she's going to University of Virginia. She probably came from a very supportive, very stable family, and they probably cooked breakfast in the mornings and enjoyed a meal together before starting their day. Just an FYI. Back to the story. It is during the time that I'm alone in the mornings, before waking my wife, and again only during the winter months, that I witness this unexplainable phenomenon. While I'm sitting on the couch, sipping my hot coffee in front of a crackling fire in the wood stove, I can hear what sounds like the dial tone and sometimes light ringing of an old rotary phone, and it sounds as if it is coming from within the living room wall, halfway between where the wood stove sits in the corner of the room, facing the front of the house. It took me some time to believe that I was hearing what I was hearing when it first started, and it took me some time after that to narrow down the exact location of the sound. More than half a dozen times each winter that we've lived in our house, this being the 6th winter, I have stood beside the wall with my ear to it, listening to this strange sound. The wall can't be more than a foot thick before it reaches the outside of the house, certainly not wide enough for a hidden phone nook. Though phones were invented a quarter of a century before our house was built in 1903, our house was originally built as a sharecropper's house. Think financially challenged people. And I doubt its original residents ever had a telephone. Again, this only happens in the winter, and I cannot even begin to explain any of it, but the story this brings to mind, the story which relays actual events that I experienced firsthand, is as follows. I attended college at a small state school in the backwoods of some small town far, far, far from the interstate in West Bygod, Virginia. The school was a hotspot for first-generation college students like me and non-traditional students. Most of the faculty had graduated from this college, hence its merit is not worth mentioning because it has little, nor is its name worth mentioning, but it was a bona fide college nonetheless, and this is where our tale begins. I had a bit of an eccentric friend at this school. His name was Jim, but it's not Jim Brown. Jim was both a first-generation college student like myself, and he was also a non-traditional student. Jim was in his mid-40s, and having been half a dozen years too young to participate in the hoopla of the 1960s, he was a bit of an outcast when he'd done the whole hippie thing in the early 70s. After seeking meaningful causes to protest for 2 decades, his efforts all in vain, he decided in the mid-1990s, the time during which I was in college, and we knew each other, to go to college and get a degree and ease himself into the establishment for the purposes of earning a living. He'd actually gotten a haircut, too. Jim was eccentric, and this is what drew us together, as I, though a bit more straight-laced than Jim, had been accused many times of being eccentric myself. We'd met while working together on the school's newspaper staff, and our friendship had formed instantly. Once, during the fall of the year, our second year at school, Jim invited me to accompany him to his family's old cabin and camp for the upcoming weekend. He told me his family owned about 100 acres of woodland in a neighboring county, and that they'd had an old log home that had stood for more than a century. Though big game such as deer or bear was not yet in season, squirrel, rabbit, and turkey were all in season, and he said we could spend the weekend hunting these small game animals and eating our take. He didn't have to twist my arm, as I would have been more than happy to accompany him anyway. Our small college was also known as a suitcase college, meaning most of the students went back home on the weekends, and I never did, which meant I usually spent the weekends alone. Jim's invitation was perfect. One of the things I remember about Jim's family's land is how remote it was. Once we turned off of the main 2-lane highway and onto the first back road to reach the property, I soon knew that there was no way I could ever go back and find it again, because there must have been nearly a dozen other turns we made onto the other back roads, most of them unpaved, before reaching said property. I remember thinking, if someone wanted to evade capture or hide bodies, this would be the place. But I knew Jim was harmless, and I never felt as if I were in any danger. Upon reaching the old 2-story log home, I was greatly impressed. Sure, you could tell that the dwelling had been neglected in recent years, perhaps the entire last generation, but it had been built so well it had managed to stand the test of time regardless. Upon stepping into the old home, I noticed the walls had been constructed with old wormy chestnut lumber, much of it 2 feet in width, and Jim informed me the beams used for the framing had been solid hickory. In a word, this 2-story log home would stand another century, easily, and still look pretty much as it did the day I saw it back in the mid-1990s. Let's get our stuff moved in and get a bite to eat, and then we can go hunting, Jim said, laying one of his bags down on a dusty old couch in the living room. It's not that cold today, so we'll wait to build a fire after we come back in from the woods. Okay, I said, still surveying the downstairs. I felt like I'd stepped back in time by at least a century, and I remember being so happy I'd taken Jim up on his invitation. After moving all of our belongings into the cabin, Jim went upstairs and produced 2 20-gauge single-shot shotguns. He brought them downstairs, handed one to me, as well as about a dozen size 4-shot shotgun shells, and said, "Let's go," and we did. Get my 6. They're back there knocking. Jim took me up a trail that led to the top of the mountain above the cabin, about half-a-mile hike, and he left me sitting beside a big oak tree, its acorns falling so heavily it sounded like a hailstorm at times, and then he went further out to the end of the ridge to sit and wait for squirrels himself. Needless to say, with the mast falling as it was, neither of us had to wait long before bagging a few bushy-tailed squirrels. I got 3 and he got 4. And we were easily back to the cabin, squirrels skinned out and frying in the old cast iron skillet on top of an old wood stove in the kitchen, well before dark. Boy, here comes a big one. Gosh, I love October. Best time of year. I'd built a fire in the large stone fireplace in the living room, while Jim had cooked our squirrels. He'd also fried up some potatoes and onions in a different pan on top of the old wood stove. And when we sat in the living room to eat in front of the fireplace just after nightfall, we ate like true hillbilly kings. Jim was just beginning to tell me about his family's history on the property when all of a sudden, a phone rang. This phone was in the living room in which we'd been sitting, though I hadn't noticed it. It was in a back corner off from the fireplace. Same place where I kind of hear the sound in my living room in the winter. Jim answered the phone, and I overheard him having a conversation that didn't sound so pleasant. "Well, this sucks," he said, coming back to the other side of the room after the call had ended. "What's up?" I asked. "That was my sister," Jim said, "in Ohio. Our aunt died, and I need to go out there tomorrow for the service. I guess she passed away about a week ago, but my sister wasn't able to reach me." This, of course, was back when cell phones were just a fantasy of the future. And since Jim lived off campus with no phone, there had been no way for his sister to reach him until he'd gone to the cabin for the weekend, which he usually did, and which his sister knew. "How far away is it?" I asked. "Would you like me to go with you?" No, Jim said, no need for this to spoil your weekend. It's not far, maybe an hour and a half, just across the Ohio River past Parkersburg. I'll leave in the morning and be back early Sunday. We'll leave for school midday and still be back at school before dark. You sure? I asked. I mean, I don't mind staying here alone. It's beautiful. But if you want company, I don't mind going. No, Jim assured me again. It's fine. My family isn't very large and we're all very private. Like, to the point of paranoia of strangers. Just hang out here and enjoy yourself, and we'll have a redo of this weekend, maybe next weekend. Or even better, next month when deer season is in, if you'd like. There's some monster bucks up on this mountain. Okay, I said, and that was that. It was settled. Jim and I stayed up as late as we could that night, which was only until about 10 p.m. I'll never cease to be amazed at how when you're in a house with electricity and all the modern conveniences, which these days mean speedy internet connection and flat-screen televisions, one can stay up half the night, often finding it hard to fall asleep. But when in a rustic setting, or especially in a tent in the woods, once the sun goes down, one begins fighting for life to keep their eyes open. It's a welcome experience I feel too many people don't get enough of. My diagnosis for insomnia is not a medication but a camping trip, just an FYI. The next morning, Jim and I woke naturally around 7 a.m. It didn't take him long to scramble a pan full of eggs to go with our leftovers from the night before. After a quick breakfast, Jim was off to Ohio, and I was up on top of the mountain, 20-gauge shotgun in hand, looking for more squirrels. I certainly saw more that morning than I cared to shoot, as we still had leftovers from the night before, so I only harvested 2 more. I found that Jim had been right about the monster bucks. I had a 10-point with brow tines nearly a foot long walk within 20 yards of me. Since the wind was blowing toward me, he never smelled me, and since I never moved an inch, he passed within 15 yards of me, at his absolute closest, without noticing me. I couldn't wait to come back in November when deer season would be in and get a chance at harvesting him. I made my way back to Jim's log home around midday. I skinned out my 2 squirrels, refrigerated them in the ref that looked older than me. I would later find out that it was. And then I lay down on the couch and fell asleep. Me and my afternoon naps go way back. I was awakened by the sound of the phone ringing about half an hour later. I rose and I walked over to the phone in the dark corner of the room off from the fireplace and I answered it. Hello, I said, and all I heard was a dial tone. That's odd, I said, hanging up. And then I heard it again. It was only then that I realized that the ringing sound was coming from another part of the house. I thought that I simply hadn't realized that there was another phone in the house, so I went looking for it. It sounded as if it were coming from just inside the back door. But when I made my way around the corner and into the hall, facing the back door directly, the ringing had stopped. I walked to the back door and I found that there was no phone. There was just a small closet that held a few jackets and a couple of pairs of old boots, but definitely no phone. I wrote the whole incident off to a dream and went back to the couch. Seeing that I could not fall back to sleep, I ate a bit, leftovers, and then I went back outside into the woods. Though I had my shotgun with me, I wasn't necessarily hunting. I've never killed more animals than I could eat, and our squirrel supply was full. Instead, I used my time, what remained of daylight hours, that beautiful October afternoon, to simply stroll through the woods and take in the beauty. It was the peak of autumn and the leaves were in their full autumn glory. The scenery alone was just one of many reasons October has always been my favorite time of year. I got back to the log home and built a fire in the fireplace just before dark. After a hefty dinner of, you guessed it, leftover squirrel and potatoes and onions, I found myself drifting off to sleep even earlier than I had the night before, largely because Jim wasn't there to keep me awake with wonderful conversation. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was awakened by the sound of a phone ringing. This time, instead of rising and going immediately to the phone in the living room, I lay on my back, listening. When the phone rang again, I could clearly tell that it was coming from the area of the back door. I'd laying a flashlight on the floor beside the couch where I was sleeping. I turned it on and headed for the sound of the phone. When I made the turn into the hallway this time, I shined my light to the end of the hall. The light was not too bright, as the batteries in the light were nearly dead. However, it was bright enough to vaguely cast a dim light onto the back door, and it appeared as if someone or something was standing in front of it. "Jim," I said, "is that you?" And just like that, what had been a dark figure in front of the door, nay, the shadow of a man cast upon the door by my light, but oddly, with no man in between my light and the door to cast the shadow, being a more apt description, vanished, as if it had never been there at all, and the ringing of the phone ceased. Again, I wrote the whole experience off to a dream, and I returned to the couch, and I did not wake the rest of the night. The next day, I woke up around 7 a.m. I'd had my fill of squirrels for the weekend, so I ate only fried eggs with potatoes and onions. I went hiking afterward and didn't even take the shotgun. When I returned to the log home around noon, Jim was just returning from his trip to Ohio. "I brought pizza," he said, getting out of the car with a box from Little Caesars. "Praise God," I said. Hey, I love roughing it at times as much as anyone, but what college student is going to turn down pizza? As Jim and I ate pizza in the living room in front of the still burning embers of the fire I'd had the night before and into the morning, he told me of his trip to Ohio. We discussed our trip back to college, and we were already making plans to come back in November to go deer hunting. Jim told me he'd also seen the big buck I'd seen the day before, and the competition was on for which one of us would bag it. "I had a couple of weird dreams while you were gone," I told Jim as our conversation began to lag. I told him what had happened with the strange ringing sounds of the phone and the shadow, if that's what it was, that I believed I'd seen. "Wow," Jim said. "Wow what?" "Our family actually has two home places," he explained. "This one and the one in Ohio." Jim went on to explain about how his great-grandmother had actually left his great-grandfather roughly a century before. She'd fled from their home, this home, in the rolling hills of West Bygod, Virginia, and she had gone back to her family in rural Flat, Ohio. Jim's great-grandfather, it appears, suffered from bipolar disorder back before that or any other sort of mental illness or disorder was understood. Though Jim's great-grandmother loved her husband, she hated the continual feelings that the other shoe was about to drop. The man never harmed her physically, but when he would go through his manic phases, he would rant and rave, and he was completely miserable to be around. At times, he took to drinking, which made his mental illness even more unbearable. She would leave him and then come back, Jim explained, over and over, and each time she left, she swore it would be the last, but it never was. It would just take her longer and longer each time to go back to him, but she did go back to him every time. Jim explained that though it was long ago, and though his family were rural people, his family did have means, at least by the standards of the era, and they'd actually been the first family to have a telephone installed in their home. It had been installed in a small phone closet by the back door of the house. Each time she left him, Jim explained, my grandfather would pace the hall, back by the phone, waiting for her call. The last time she left, he got tired of waiting for the call that never came, and he took matters into his own hands. "What do you mean?" I asked, seeking clarification. "Well," he said, "she finally did call, but she got no answer. She called for days, and after getting no answer for days, she finally came back from Ohio. When she got here, she found him hanging from a tree out back. Just outside the back door. She ended up going back to Ohio, and no one has lived at this house full-time since. We've just always used it as a hunting cabin, like you and I have done this weekend." Needless to say, I did not go back with Jim to hunt for deer in November. I did not go back to that old log home in the deep, dark woods of West Bygod, Virginia with Jim ever again. The end. If you enjoyed that story, again, though the books are available on Amazon and from Etsy, you don't have to buy one to hear the rest. Just keep coming back to this channel, Homesteading Off the Grid, every night this month of October to hear the rest of the stories, because stories absolutely do have a lot to do with homesteading. See you for more next time.